I'm trying to record a podcast.
Hey folks, and welcome to Your Natural Dog. Today we have a really great conversation with Jason Scott, our resident myco-alchemist. Jason is a mycologist and just a real expert and source of knowledge in the field of medicinal mushrooms and fungi. And he's also our partner in formulation and manufacturing of MycoDog's products. This conversation really centers around the questions about why this industry has still yet to really settle on some standardized ways to measure the types of products that we're looking at, and why it can be so hard to patent and standardize these natural products. So we talk about all sorts of different really important concepts when it comes to medicinal mushrooms, and kind of geek out at a high level with this really intelligent guy. So here you go. Welcome, Jason Scott.
This is Blanche, and she's the most noodle-ish dog you've ever met in your entire life. She's just the most loved dog you've ever met, but if you leave her alone, it becomes the total opposite thing. Blanche has severe separation anxiety to the point where she will scratch doors down to the wood, bark all night, cry if you leave her for 5 minutes. I tried the collars, I tried the sprays, I tried thunder blankets. The only thing that's ever worked was CBD, and that's why I got started in this business. Our calm tincture is 550 milligrams of full spectrum CBD and lavender. It's the perfect remedy for separation anxiety, stress, or fear. I love my dog, and I hated knowing that she was home freaking out. So I wanted to find an all-natural way to do it. No doggy Prozac, all natural. And once I found CBD, there's no other option. CBD Dog Health, healing naturally.
And we're back with Jason Scott, my very favorite myco-alchemist. And a lot of the questions I'm going to be asking you today, Jason, I already know the answers to. But I wanted to share basically what I went through when I was searching for someone with your expertise and qualifications when I was looking for someone to make MycoDog's formulations. Because I am not a formulator. I don't know how to formulate. I don't know how to formulate mushroom products. I also don't know how to extract them correctly, like I know how to extract cannabis. So you were my expert. You were the person that I found. And I kind of want to share with my audience all the questions I asked you and what we went through before I said, yep, this is my guy. Because I get asked them all the time. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to let the expert tell you instead of me. I know a lot about mushrooms, but I don't know how to extract them and preserve them correctly like you do. So we're going to start with, what is a myco-alchemist?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. Well, first of all, I just want to say hello, and I'm really glad to be back on again with y'all and talking about mushrooms and
Woohoo.
stuff. It's always a fun time. Yeah, I think the intersection of my work is at the crossroads of mycology and alchemy. So I like to work through the alchemical lens of laboratory processing and working with the fungi, which is what led to years and years of research and different types of extraction methods rather, and working with different parts of the mushroom and just trying to see like how to properly extract them. So all of my early explorations into extraction came from that alchemical tradition and a fascination with fungi and functional fungi and how to properly extract them through the lens of the traditional alchemical framework, which is like a huge rabbit hole. Maybe someday we could just like talk all about alchemy and spagyrics and things like that. But so I would say a myco-alchemist, I suppose, is somewhere to the cross-section of traditional hermetic alchemy as applied in the lab and mycology and working with functional mushrooms through that lens. And when I started my journey along that path, you know, the traditional alchemical framework has a lot of foundations laid for working with herbs and even for working with like different animal materials and metals and minerals, but not really anything in the terms of mushrooms. So my approach was like, well, mushrooms kind of live between plants and animals and are in their own kingdom there. And so I think we should approach them differently, because in those traditional frameworks, if they got mentioned at all, which was very minimally, it was literally just kind of tagging them on to the end of the plant kingdom, and I think that was doing a huge disservice in understanding, one, how we look at mushrooms and fungi, but two, how we properly extract them.
See, you were already ahead of the times because just now mushrooms finally have its own classification of fungi. So we have fauna,
Flora.
fauna, flora, sorry, and fungi. So you were ahead of your time, and I love that. Let's just talk about what do other companies do that are extracting from their mushrooms? Who is their person? What is there a person? Because there aren't like schools, like I went to the first accredited program at the University of Vermont for cannabis, what is there out there? How do they know what they're doing? Are they following a book, a tradition? I know this is probably the biggest reason we're given why mushrooms are grown in China, because they've been doing it, the right way for however long. Who's doing it? How are they doing it? What rules are they following?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a really big question. And I think, ultimately the mushroom industry and the mushroom extraction industry is really in its infancy in a lot of ways still. And just to kind of give a little bit of context, I've been in the field of mycology for over 10 years now, I think even over 12 years at this point, looking at different ways to apply functional mushrooms, experimenting, and things like that. And, I early on found myself in a lot of self-study and a lot of independent programs, and then applying a lot of methods that were fitting into other things to mushrooms because there just wasn't really a precedence for it. And also, early on there was only a few voices of authority in the field of mycology that were talking about medicinal mushroom extracts and what part was better and why. And so I just kind of like put all of that to the test at the very beginning of it. And I think for me, like that was my education, right? My education was like direct experience and experimentation and putting things to action. So putting my hands in it, working with different types of lab equipment, working with more simple methods, working with the mycelium on grain, working with pure mycelium, working with the fruit body, fermenting all of it. So I kind of like did all of it just to kind of like see what the results were and to be able to compare and contrast and test. And that's really how I kind of landed on the process that I currently use today. But I think it's really challenging because at that time, early on, there was really two types of products, which are the ones that are dominating the market today, which are myceliated grain. That's going to be the most prominent, and those are oftentimes grown and produced in the US. And then we also have fruit body extracts or fruit body powders, and those are often coming from overseas, primarily China, but there's different places in Asia, some places in Europe sometimes. And I think when I started Feral Fungi, which never really intended to be a big company or a company, I started it as a part I was teaching at a conference talking about the doctrine of signatures, planetary correspondences with fungi, and I had a free booth at that conference. And so I was like, well, I'm going to apply some of these extraction methods that I've been experimenting with for the past 6-7 years, and I'm going to put them to action and make a product line because I have this free booth, so I might as well take advantage of it. And it really just kind of spiraled from there. And that was in 2016, I think, that I did that. So I'm sure at this point, a lot of your listeners are like a lot more familiar with mushrooms. In the past 2 to 3 years, it has just become a booming industry, no pun intended. And it just is, it's crazy to see the awareness around mushrooms grow, because when I first started this, it's like nobody knew what mushrooms were, right? It's like we would get just kind of like blank stares whenever we started talking about functional mushrooms. And so I really got the chance to kind of like put into action, and I put some sort of like hard stops on like what the foundation of our company was at that time, which is I really want to source everything domestically because I really believe that the foundation of our medicine and like what makes our medicine potent starts from the raw material. So like, where's it coming from? Who's growing it? What is even the thought and the intention that that person is putting into it? How are people harvesting it if we're working with wild mushrooms? And then receiving those whole mushrooms so that I can identify it, look at it, see what it is, grind it up myself, and then extract it myself through these methods that I found to be really effective. And our goal from the outset was never to create like a standardized extract or like a standardized for any sort of specific compounds. Primarily, one, at that point, it just like there wasn't really anybody talking about those standards, kind of like very, very early on in the cannabis industry. But also, it like my goal at that time was like, how do we get the most holistic product that we can? How do we get like the most full picture from the mushroom? And that's just kind of like leaning into the spagyric anatomy and the philosophy coming from that alchemical tradition. So back to kind of like what other products are, right? We have the myceliated grain, which is a predominant portion of the US market. And there's a lot of people who even use the term like full spectrum in terms of mushroom extracts. And then what that basically means is like we have myceliated grain with maybe some fruit bodies in there. But my biggest question is like, well, okay, well, if you have fruit bodies in there, like what's the percentage? Are you using 50% fruit body, 50% mycelium? But nobody's going to tell you that stuff, because one of the biggest issues that I have with the functional mushroom industry, supplement industry in general, is just there seems to be like a large lack of transparency. And that's one thing I really appreciate about you guys as well, is like, I've always looked to try to like, how do we cut through that, right? How do we be transparent about what we're producing, what we're making, and how do we work together to kind of like set a better standard for what we're doing and how we're expressing that stuff. So,
and we're literally working together to help set those standards and figure out what those standards are, because they don't exist.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like what
it's
you
so
said
interesting
about
though.
full spectrum. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so go ahead, Carter.
No, please, Jason.
Yeah. So the myceliated grain, right, is I've heard people say like, oh, it's the immune system of the mushrooms because it's the mycelium is like the primary portion of the fungi, but it just doesn't really hold any water, that kind of argument. And oftentimes what we see in the scientific literature is that if people are doing any sort of experiments on mycelium, the most effective cases are when they're doing like a pure mycelium grown in a liquid broth, purifying or extracting it from that liquid broth, drying it out, and then oftentimes even extracting it with like really high volatile types of solvents like ether to get like a pure extract of the mycelium.
An isolate.
So an isolate, and then those tests are oftentimes like in vitro. And then the ones that they have done that they're using any sort of like people for, the sample sizes are very small. They're not using really like solid scientific methods from anything that I've seen. So, it just doesn't really hold water to say that. And I go kind of based off of the literature that I've read and that I've looked at for working with and using the fruit body, but also the traditional use, right? And so people have for thousands and thousands of years used the fruit of the mushroom. And it's so weird to me that we even have to say like fruiting body or the fruit, because mushroom is the fruit or the fruiting body. So any product that claims to be a mushroom product that doesn't include the fruit body or the mushroom is not really a mushroom product, right? It's then a mycelium.
It's false advertising
product. Yeah.
Right.
I
always I try and get people to think of like, if people in ancient China are going and getting reishi from a log in the woods, they're not then taking that hardwood log and grinding it up to put it in a capsule for you to take the mycelium too. The history of these mushrooms
that's a great
is
analogy.
The fruiting body.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like to me that sort of like image is really comical to think about, like somebody looking through the forest trying to find mushrooms, and then they find this beautiful reishi mushroom, and then instead of taking the mushroom, they like you said, take the log, or like with other mushrooms, take the dirt and the little bit of mycelium that's in it, and it's like mycelium is only one cell wall thick. So that's kind of like the big thing with myceliated grain, right? Is like, and it's not to say, because I run into this all the time where people are like, well, what is better, mycelium or fruit body? And I was like, well, they both have benefits, but you don't get those benefits from a myceliated grain product the same way you do from pure mycelium. And they're just different, right? It's like you get different benefits from both. And I think
And there's a reason. I'd like that you said that.
Yeah.
Because it
Yeah.
makes a difference. That's what the biggest problem is that a mushroom is a bioaccumulator and getting all of its nutrients from whatever it's eating. And if it's eating oats, I don't know, with, let's say, oats that have glyphosate on them or grain or sawdust. I didn't even know that this was a thing. And this sawdust is a byproduct of the lumber or sawmill industry, as it is in China, that I remember when I first saw that, or what I was taught was, it's a cheap substrate. It's a byproduct of the lumber industry. So stay away from brands that are doing that. Even if they treated that byproduct with something, it was still chemically treated, and it's still not okay for me. But you even educated me that, Angie, they can't just inoculate the spores of that they can't just put the spores on that sawdust. And what are they feeding them? Grain. So literally you have a product that is being grown on the wrong substrate and being fed grain, and that's not what mushrooms eat. And the most important thing that I think we need to talk about today is the medicinal properties that are in these mushrooms, that you're not going to find these medicinal properties from mushrooms grown on a sawdust or on a grain. You're only going to find those medicinal properties if they're grown on the correct substrate. For instance, chaga and the birch tree. And the fact that if they're growing on grain, which that same company that's growing on sawdust is growing their chaga on sawdust, it does not have betulinic acid in it, because chaga has to be grown on a live birch tree. And it's not just chaga. So I'd love to speak of that, because that's what I believe you're going for. You're going for the medicinal compounds that make these mushrooms so incredible, not just the beta glucans, which is what everybody seems to be concentrating on.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I mean, that's kind of like a multifaceted question and approach. So just to kind of like give a little clarity around like mushroom cultivation and how that works, and then sort of our approach to how we select our materials and things like that. So it's very common for most cultivators, if not all cultivators, to use grain at some point in their process. And that's not necessarily to say that it's bad, as long as at some point it ends up on the right medium to be able to grow. And so the mushrooms or the fungi use the sugars from the grain, and that's why it grows so well on them. That's also why like myceliated grain products are so prominent, is because it's really easy to get fungi to thrive on grains because they're so rich in those sugars. But that is oftentimes like when you're cultivating for the fruit, that's the starting material, right? That's what you call your grain spawn, is like how you're kind of like running out the cultures for the mushrooms that you're going to grow. Most companies skip the process where they're then putting it onto some sort of hardwood and then turning it into the fruit, because that part becomes extremely energy intensive. The way that I think about it is like you can grow many, many different species of mycelium, of fungi mycelium, in a similar environment and conditions, because you're doing it in these like closed bags, and you're doing it in a similar sort of humidity, similar sort of temperature. And a lot of fungi will run at that same temperature and humidity. But to get different mushroom species to fruit, or different fungi species to fruit mushrooms, you have to change the environmental conditions, and you have to put them on the right substrate. So oftentimes what a lot of really skilled growers will do is they'll take the mushroom mycelium that's growing on, or the fungi mycelium that's growing on the grain, and then they'll spread a little bit of that out into the proper substrate, which is oftentimes some sort of hardwood for a lot of the different mushrooms. Some of the mushrooms prefer compost. It just depends on the species that you're working with. But like you said, it's like you want to be real. If you're working with cultivated mushrooms, you want to be really careful and cautious about where you're sourcing that material, because if you aren't, and you do have, say, like sawdust that's been collected from the lumber industry with a lot of oils and things like that, the mushrooms could definitely accumulate those things. And the biggest kind of like pitfall that we have with a lot of testing is we can test for things that we directly ask to test for, like heavy metals or microbials or these like specific compounds. But everything else that we don't ask specifically to test for is kind of like blind items. So it's like if you're not specifically testing on whether there's carbons from the oils that are in that material, then you're not going to see it, even if it's in there, or if you have plastics or something that are in there. So I think we started the company and we worked with both cultivated and wild harvested mushrooms. And I will always, in my own personal practice and preparation, lean towards wild harvested plants and mushrooms, just because I think that there is not only sort of a natural efficacy to something growing in its natural habitat and getting the nutrients and everything from that place, but also I think there's a little bit of natural vitality that just can't be mimicked in something that's cultivated, no matter how intentional the cultivation process is. That being said, being in a commercial industry where we're producing large scale extracts, or I mean, we're still really small scale relative to like large scale companies, but larger scale, and just kind of even the volume that we're currently using, we've had to cultivate relationships with cultivators and wild harvesters, because like you said, there's some mushrooms like chaga, we would never buy that cultivated unless somebody had figured out a way to cultivate it on the birch and make sure that it did get the secondary metabolites that are coming from that birch tree, like you mentioned, like that betulinic acid, there's like vanillin acids, different things that you can get. But I think that when things are cultivated intentionally and done in a really good way, that we can still get a lot of the really valuable compounds out of those mushrooms. And we see that, there's not a hugely significant difference in some of these different mushrooms as long as they're grown on the right substrate. So it's there's a two-sided issue there, because there's like a handful of mushrooms that we work with, for example, like lion's mane, which we're processing, hundreds and hundreds of pounds a month of lion's mane. It would be really difficult for us to get that all from a wild source. But we have cultivators who grow lion's mane on the proper substrate, and we get a really strong extract from it. And we're getting a lot of those secondary metabolites. And then, not only as we're trying to figure out how we're validating kind of like what sort of beta glucan content and other secondary metabolites we're getting in that process, we also just see the results, right? It's like we get so much anecdotal evidence from people, and then you guys from the dogs. And I love the dogs anecdotal evidence, because it's like dogs don't get the placebo effect the same way that people do, right? It's like
Nope.
it works or it doesn't. And so, I mean, we've heard amazing things, but a lot of the lion's mane, for example, that we use is cultivated, but we have our cultivators who are working really really diligently to source their starting material. So it's like it's the starting material all the way down the line. And it's like the starting material that we use for our process comes from growers and cultivators and wild harvesters who are using starting material that they're really diligent about making sure that they're producing the highest quality themselves. And we've worked really hard to kind of cultivate those relationships to make sure that we can kind of secure that supply chain. And it's cool to see because it's becoming so much more prominent. But when I started this in 2016, there's no way we could have gotten hundreds of pounds of dried lion's mane every month, wild or cultivated. It just wasn't. Nobody was doing that in the U.S. So it's like it's amazing to be able to see that, and we're really proud to be kind of like on the leading edge of cultivating those relationships and making the best quality extracts we can with them.
I love that. I want people to realize though that I just heard this statistic from Food Inc. too, and it's about factory farming. That 96% of our beef, chicken, dairy, and eggs comes from a factory farm in the United States. I want to say the same thing about mushrooms. If it's from whether it's from China or overseas or in the United States, I would say that 96% of mushroom products on the market are mycelated grain, I can't even say the word right now, grain, and have no fruiting body or stems on it, and or they're grown on an incorrect substrate, meaning
Hmm.
sawdust from a sawmill, oats, rice, grain, sorghum, straw. I got some straw people who look like they're doing it right for culinary mushrooms, have no idea what the medicinal compounds are. That's literally what it's going to come down to, is that Jason and I are going to be able to prove to you that these tonics have the medicinal properties that we want in them. And we're working on that because it doesn't exist. It is
Hmm.
It's a lot like the cannabis industry where there was no regulation or standardization, which there is now. That doesn't even exist for mushrooms now. So it's literally impossible for us to compare apples to apples, because I have only found maybe one other person who is doing what you're doing and making products like you are. And that's why it took me so long to find someone like you, is because this is something that takes a lot of time, a lot of research, a lot of experimentation, a lot of reading, a lot of looking at old extract. You basically are your main goal is to get all of those compounds out of that mushroom without damaging them. And that's what was most important to me. And that's why we can't, our best source of knowing that we've made an incredible product is by the people who are taking it and feeling the difference and watching cancer tumors shrink, and watch dogs go into remission, watch dogs finally calm down, watch dogs who have dementia, literally it reverses it, like literally stop getting lost, sleep through the night. So yeah, anybody can say anything to me, but I've watched it over and over and over again on my rescue farm, and now we have thousands and thousands of people who are using your product. You make a human version where thousands of people are using your products. They can't tell us otherwise, Jason. They can't. Carter, can they tell you? You've taken them.
Yeah, I mean, there's just kind of like a logical end that you can follow, that like, if you produce them in this way, it should yield better results. I kind of draw the parallel of like the way that we look at our farming and our crops. If you grow your crops on soil that is depleted and dead and doesn't have its own kind of active biome, you're not going to get as nutrient dense crops. And it's the same thing if you're growing your mycelium and your fruiting bodies from things that are not from the same nutrient density,
That are
your
dead.
medicinal properties that are dead, your medicinal properties are not going to be at the optimal level that they could be if you were growing it with the correct growing practices. So
Yeah.
it's the same theories that we're looking at kind of in all of our viewpoints in holistic medicine and care
Yeah.
for our
A
animals.
a pasture raised cow eating grass that, to up till its last day is going to have the nutrients that you need. A cow, factory
Right.
farmed, it's not going to have the nutrients. And matter of fact, it's going to have things in it that's more harmful than
Right.
helpful.
Well,
Corn-fed
yeah.
beef is like the same thing as like a oat-fed mushroom.
Amen.
Yeah. Well,
There's a clip right there.
there's that, right? And then there's, I mean, when I started, I chose not to source from China for multiple reasons, right? There's the kind of like, people hang their hats on all sorts of different things, such as like purity, potency, things like that. How rigorous their organic certification actually is, and I think those are all potential valid concerns. But one of the things that is the biggest thing to me, again, going to the root of like, oh, where does our medicine come from, or like what's the root or source of it? And for me, it's like it's not just the ecological impact of sourcing things from China, but it's the social impact too. Because when we buy hundreds of pounds of mushrooms from local farmers, we're keeping all of that money in a local economy. We're supporting people who live right up the road. We're supporting their livelihood, their passions. They're getting to do something that they want, as opposed to sending all that money, that time, that energy, that resource overseas. And then, you know, we get to receive the full fruit body, and we can look at it and identify it and know that there's absolutely no adulterants in it. There's another problem that comes along with powders that oftentimes gets overlooked. And I know a handful of private label manufacturers that won't accept powders from, especially from overseas companies, because they have received whole herbs and then it's been adulterated with all sorts of things, garbage, plastic, things that you probably don't even really want to know about. And then when they take that and say, hey, like, we can't accept these herbs because there's all this stuff in it, the company that they get it from says, oh, we'll just grind it up, nobody will know. And it's like, well, no, we're not just going to grind it up and make sure nobody knows. It's like, we don't want these things in it. And they're like, okay, we'll send it back to us, we'll grind it up, and then we'll resell it. And so there's an issue, as I mentioned earlier, with like powders, where it's like you can identify positively, ID what you're looking for in there, but finding the adulterants, unless you know specifically what you're looking for, is a lot harder. And that's one of the biggest questions that's kind of been coming up with me too, in these like mass amounts of products that are coming out of China, because I know that they're doing a spray drying process on those extracts. And if you've ever ground up mushrooms, even if you use really high quality material, like machinery, like a hammer mill, to try and get it into a similar uh, feel, density, different mushrooms just turn out differently. Like reishi and turkey tail end up being like really fluffy, almost like insulation. It kind of looks and feels like, and it's really hard to get that into like a solid powder. Versus like lion's mane will dry out and that will turn into a powder really easily, or like cordyceps will dry out and that will turn into a powder really easily. But the thing that just doesn't like line up for me personally is that, you know, even the lion's mane and cordyceps, which might be similar in kind of texture and feel, will be different densities, and then reishi will be an even different density. So it's like you can have 100 grams of each of those, but they're going to look extremely different. And so I'm like, you know, maybe there's something I don't understand about how things are being processed over there, but to me there's something that doesn't make sense about, well, how are you guys getting all of these to be the same density and flowability? And my biggest kind of question is like, well, maybe there's like some sort of flow agent, something that they're sort of standardizing the extracts onto, because that's oftentimes how spray drying works, you know? And so that's just a question that comes up with me. And I think that it's hard because there's a lot of people who are posturing in the sense of being really transparent, and they're like, oh yeah, we've got all sorts of third party testing. But then you ask for that third party testing, and what they give you is something that they've stamped themselves, and then they won't share anything from the labs that have actually tested it. And so there's just a transparency issue. And then I think there's just an issue of the narrative being controlled by certain entities who've been in the industry for a really long time, and really trying to shape and kind of like, you know, they've built their whole industry around sourcing the mushrooms from there. So they're like doubling down on it. I've seen like posts coming out
Oh,
where they're
hell
like,
yeah.
it is not financially feasible to source mushrooms from the United States. And they're like, well, we
I've heard
do
that.
it and we pay our employees well and we take care of them, and you guys are doing it, and you guys are sourcing from a company that's sourcing all of the mushrooms in the US. And it's like, it's not that it's impossible. It's like, what's your bottom line and what's your kind of like tolerance for greed, I suppose, because it's like maybe your top dollar is not going to be quite as much, because I can guarantee we don't make as much of a profit margin as like myceliated grain products or like Chinese sourced mushroom extracts. But I don't think I'd be able to personally sleep if I was doing things that way, because it's like, for me, this is about like helping people and helping the animals. And it's like, it's not about what my bottom dollar is. I know, you know, we all need to survive, right? It's like, we all need to get
Right.
by, but it's like, to me, it's about more than that. It doesn't feel like it's that way for a lot of people. especially now, it's like the mushroom industry is becoming so flooded with so many different people who have never even looked twice at mushrooms until they were popular. So it's
Of sort,
uh,
just like CBD, just like
yep,
CBD. And I want
yep.
people to understand that when I said that analogy of that 96%, there's literally like 2 or 3 huge players, manufacturers. I'm calling them big mushroom. Like we have big pharma, big ag, big mushroom. And those 3 people are, when you look at the pictures of their operations, they're literally sweatshops. They're literally just acting like they're just sourcing them. So they need however many pounds of lion's mane. They go to these farmers and buy them. And I'm watching the piles of sawdust on the floor being, with people that literally looks like sweatshops, kids stuffing some sort of plastic bag and putting the holes and to me, that is not what I want. I used to be a person that bought my mushrooms from there. And when COVID hit is literally when I really started to see everything crumble and made me go down that rabbit hole to find out how everything was done. And it's not okay. I looked up spray drying because my number one question was, why are we drying a liquid extract? And Jason did the same experiments that I did. When I looked at a freeze dried liquid extract, it looked completely different than what I was getting in that pouch. And I started asking questions and got educated by you and so many others. And when I looked up spray drying, why are we taking that liquid extract, drying it, and why are we not doing it where we know the best way to retain all of its nutrients would be to freeze dry it or slow dry it, over time, like a dehydration process. But that's not what they do. They do something called spray drying. So I started to research spray drying, and spray drying adds other ingredients in that spray dryer to fluff and give you that not only more bulking weight, but that more consistency of everything. And that ingredient is not listed anywhere on that pouch. So that is something. I even went and looked and found a piece of research basically saying, why are they doing this spray drying? Just this is exactly why they're doing it. And guess what? That's the number one concern of us getting products from China, is that they are adulterated, and we'll never know. We'll never know. People can literally meet our farmers, meet Jason, look at how everything's done. We can source everything. We check on everything. It's just, you don't get that same thing from overseas. You don't know what's happening. So why dry a liquid extract?
Well, I mean that's a really good question, and I think a lot of times too that the industry is just kind of like racing for a standardization process, and maybe like the standardization is part of that. Also, once you remove the liquid, it's a lot lighter and probably cheaper to transport. But from what I found is like as soon as you have a powdered extract, whether you're just grinding the mushroom into a powder or if you're making an extract and then getting that into a powder, you have the opportunity for that material to oxidize a lot quicker. So it's like you lose shelf life on that. And the biggest question about powders, even if you know that it's coming from a good source, it's been processed properly, there's no adulterants, which we don't really know any of those things. But say, assuming you do know all those things, how long has it been sitting around before it was processed and post process? Because that is losing efficacy really quick. And that's one of the reasons that I really prefer liquid extracts as well. Is one, they're way more absorbable, right? So it's like powders have to go through the digestive tract and they have to be absorbed through the standard metabolic pathways in the body, whereas liquid extracts are oftentimes mostly being absorbed through the mucosal membranes in the mouth and going directly into the bloodstream. And so like the liquid extract, I have a sneaking suspicion that they're more effective at a lower dose, like milligram per milligram, than the powders, because I think about it as like Okay, well, with liquid extracts, it's like we've pre-extracted this for you. You've got what you are looking for concentrated into this extract. It's going to be going more directly into the bloodstream and be more accessible. Your body's going to be able to use more of what you take in versus like how effective is the body extracting that powder that you're consuming? And, one, the powder definitely has to be processed to some degree in order to break down the cell walls so that your body can assimilate more. But even then, it's like your liver's no way going to be as effective at extracting those compounds. I can't imagine. So I've just seen it. I've seen our tinctures be way more effective at a lower gram per gram dose than most powders claim to be. And that's my main sort of thought on to why potentially that is. But then once you get a liquid extract, it's like, especially from the spagyric perspective and method, is like it just ages like a fine wine, right? It's like it gets better over time as opposed to, it's not as likely to oxidize unless you're leaving it in like a really hot space or open in direct sunlight. But that has to be for prolonged periods of time. So I've got extracts from 10 years ago that I experimented with that are still good. And again, that's another, I think, parameter. But the other thing too is like things are moving so fast for us that we don't have to worry about things sitting around for a long time. And same with the mushrooms that we get from our growers is like, since we've been kind of like pushing the industry along and our growers along, is like most of the mushrooms we get from our growers aren't sitting around for more than, it's like they grow them, maybe
They're
they'll sit around
fresh.
for like a month at most dried, and then but sometimes not even that long, and then we're getting them and processing them, and they're fresh, and we know they're fresh because of that.
Yeah, I remember seeing photos of that from one of the world's largest suppliers from China, where they were showing giant bags of just dried mushrooms sitting on shelves, saying, "Look how many we have," and they're just sitting there waiting because when you're the one of the world's largest, you got to have it all ready at any time to make, what you need. And I just thought about, well, I know what happens to a mushroom when it dies and just sits there. It starts to get mold and starts to go bad and everything else. I love that you brought up bioavailability, more absorbable, whatever you want to call it, because Carter and I know all about this because literally that's how our CBD product is made. It's not water, it's an oil. So we had to make it a different way so that the way we manufacture it is the moment it hits the gums, it is absorbed into the bloodstream. And we already know that. If you are eating it and swallowing it, not only does it have to go through the stomach acids that break everything down and kill most everything that it doesn't recognize or know, but it also is being processed by your liver. And you're going to lose it. That's why we literally don't say put it on the food, but instead put it right on the gums because you're getting so much more of those active compounds right into the bloodstream, which is the goal to get them in there. So it's not the same because it's funny because I'm seeing the conversation already change. I'm already seeing the powder people go, if you want a liquid so bad, just mix the powder in water. What do you have to say about that, Jason?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I've seen a lot of mushroom companies that make their liquid extracts, and they're literally taking Chinese powdered extracts and then mixing them with alcohol and glycerin. And it's like, well, why do you do that? Like that, what's the point of that? That's not an effective liquid
extract. And that's
extract.
what we get compared to.
And well, because nobody has a difference, and they're like, well, this is what the leading people do, and it's like, well, no, they're not really leading people. They actually don't have really a standard for ingenuity or like thought about why they're doing things or how they're doing things. And again, it's like we extract all the mushrooms that we receive in-house because we do an alcohol extraction and a water extraction on every single mushroom. And that's another thing that just really kind of like bothers me about the mushroom industry, right? Is like, oh, well, it's only reishi and lion's mane that need a dual extraction. But then tomorrow it's going to be, oh, well, maybe chaga could use it too. And then the next day it's going to be, oh, well, I guess turkey tail could use it too. And it's just kind of like the funny thing about thinking about these things thoroughly and, and as humble way as I can try to be is like being ahead of the curve in that, because I feel like you're saying, I've seen it like years and years ago, where I had to explain the difference between myceliated grain and fruit body, where I had to explain the difference between locally sourced and domestic and internationally sourced, where I had to explain the difference between a powder and a tincture. It's like the consumer is like coming around to a lot of that on their own, and just kind of like seeing through the fluff of like what certain people are using as marketing mechanisms. And again, it's like you can sound good all you want, but at the end of the day, is like people, once they kind of latch onto something and learn about something, they're going to be more proficient in understanding it. But to me, it's like when doing those early experiments, I found that with the alcohol and with the water, I was pulling as a really dark and potent extract with both of those. And so it was like, well, why would you not extract with both, all mushrooms with both alcohol and water? And to my mind, like the response is kind of like the same as like, oh, well, it's more expensive to do it in the US. It's like, oh, well, we don't really know what those other compounds are, so they're useless to us. And I kind of look at things from the other, I kind of go the other way. I was like, okay, well, let's start with like the most holistic that we can get outside of just eating the mushroom, because you know that we don't absorb things very well when you consume a raw mushroom. And like, how do we get the most out of that? And then we can like work backwards from there and eventually kind of figure out, okay, well, is it beneficial to isolate some of these compounds? My kind of intuition is that most of the time it isn't. I mean, we kind of saw this in cannabis, where it's like, it was like, oh, it's like the CBD, it's the CBG, it's the CBN, it's this, the that. And then, oh, well, it turns out actually all these things work better if you have them together in one thing. And it's like, you know, I don't know, we just have this kind of like uh fallacy of thinking that if we isolate and identify the one thing that's working within a natural product, that we can make it better. But it's kind of like nature oftentimes has a way of balancing itself. And so you get things like you know, like the hypericum from St. John's wort, and where you isolate that from St. John's wort, then it becomes way more toxic than if you just take like a full spectrum St. John's wort extract. And it's like, I
Yep.
think the same thing kind of applies to mushrooms as well. And it's also this misnomer that I see a lot as well, because I see so many people just saying like, oh, well, you have to like have this many grams of mushrooms with like this much beta glucan content. And it's like, well, we don't really know that yet. And also it's like, if you're just taking a pure beta glucan supplement, the research on that is way different than if you're taking like a full spectrum something that has other compounds. And it's like nothing in nature works independently of anything else. It's like everything that we do, everything is like working in symbiosis, and it's working together synergetically. And like that's the way too that like mushroom formulas work. I've even seen people make claims like, oh, well, you can't use mushroom formulas because you're only getting a little bit of each mushroom. And it's like, yeah, but the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's like you're getting different aspects from that mushroom, and depending on the way that they're formulated in there, you're potentially getting something that's even more beneficial, right? Because they kind of compound on each other and they work together in ways, some ways that we understand and some ways that we don't understand. And I think that there's sort of, again, a natural intelligence. And for somebody to make the claim that formulations aren't effective because you're getting less of each mushroom, as a whole, you're getting the same amount as you would of just like an individual mushroom, but you're getting a complex and like an orchestra of beauty and like compounds and medicine from those mushrooms that you don't get from just one mushroom. And it's not to say, again, that one is necessarily better than the other, but I think that if you formulate things properly and you really think about it and you really sit with the mushrooms and the herbs that you're using and you think about the ways that they synergize, like even when I formulate things, it's like I use a lot of the same mushrooms and cross different formulas, but I use them in different proportions, because oftentimes I'll have a mushroom that's kind of like leading the formula. So it's like, okay, this mushroom is really well known for the nerve support and focus and benefits along those lines. And then this mushroom is more so for like heart and lung health, but it also has a aspect. So it's going to help with like circulation, but it's going to also help support the nerves as well. And so it's going to it's going to kind of lean on that lead mushroom and follow that more so than if you put it maybe as a lead in a heart formula and then put other mushrooms beneath it to support the heart in a different way. So I think that when you work with formulation that way, you can get really intelligent about the way that you're directing the formulas and working with them. And again, there's so many things that lie outside of the field of being able to validate scientifically, but that doesn't invalidate them. And it's not to say like that we should throw the science out with the bathwater. I think that we get a lot of valid information from the scientific information and being able to identify different compounds, but there's so many like flaws even with that field that every time we take the scientific method and say, oh, I'm going to apply this as fact and not scrutinize it at all, and it's like that's the point of science. Is like, even when you've got a developed hypothesis or theory or method, that can always be disproven or that can always be taken another way. And that's one of the biggest issues with me to where this like mushroom industry is going in the testing, because like on one side we get people who have, I'm assuming, very little to no experience with medicinal mushrooms that are reaching out to me and being like, do you guys test your mushroom extracts for hercinone contents? I'm like, no. Do you know anybody who's testing their mushroom extracts for hercinone contents? Do you know how expensive it is to get a standard for hercinone? Do you know what a standard for hercinone is? Like, where are you coming up with this information and why is it relevant is kind of like one of the biggest things. And then also like one of the other things that we've seen too, especially with the beta glucans recently, is the kind of industry standard right now that they're using to test beta glucans is the Megazyme kit, which was adapted, I believe, from testing yeasts. So it's testing the sugar content from yeast. And one of the folks that I know who does some laboratory testing and has developed a lot of different methods and things like that was recently telling me that it's a really cool application and it's a destructive method. So what it's doing is not actually measuring the amount of beta glucans, but it's destructively breaking down all of the sugars and then measuring the alpha glucans and then like subtracting from that to be able to find the amount of beta glucans. But then even the people who developed that test, which has been the standard for, the past decade, maybe a little bit less, came out recently with a paper, and I think I sent it to you guys as well, that was like, hey, actually we found out there was an error with our method and that we were getting inflated beta glucan numbers and deflated alpha glucan numbers because of a miscalculation in this part of our process. And so here's kind of like a revamped method, but I haven't seen any big companies change their numbers since that came out. So again, it's like, where is this coming from? Where does it line up? And that's the thing with testing, is like you're really dependent on the company to be transparent about what they're doing to even get a transparent idea of the testing. And so the other issue I have with that specific test, right, is that it's developed for a powder and it doesn't translate to liquids very well. And as I know, it's like I've sent the same sample to multiple different labs. I've sent the same sample to the same lab under different things, and I've gotten wildly different results from those different samples. And some places where it's like the numbers look really good but don't make sense, and some places where the numbers like just don't make sense at all. And again, it's like if it was something where it was repeatable in any sense, but it's like I just haven't seen any repetition. And so I'm wondering on multiple levels of like, what are the methods that people are using or developing? Is there some step in the process that is like invalidating the data on some level? I've even gotten negative results back. It's like, how do you have a negative value of something in a product? It's like you don't have a negative value, you either have it or you don't. And I was talking to somebody who runs a lab of his own, and I was like, hey, just like running this by you for your thoughts, like how do you get a negative value of beta glucans? And he's like, well, that doesn't really make sense. He's like, I guess unless he maybe like opened a wormhole or something, then you could potentially get a negative value. But yeah, again, to me,
learning about that Megazyme test, and then working, because Jason and I are working on creating this collaborative where we all can, do a standardization of liquid tink extracts that we all are going, yep, here we're testing the compounds. So I'm pretty sure I learned this from one of our lab partners, but I feel like those big companies out in China, the one that I worked with the most, is literally doing everything to make the beta glucans look better on that megazyme test, to the extent of that they are not doing dual extraction on most of their mushrooms because it affects the beta glucan percentage. And so that since they told everybody that's what they should be looking for, that's why they're no longer dual extracting most of their mushrooms. I think they're only dual extracting their reishi, and nothing else. So that nowhere getting the same those medicinal compounds as you doing your dual extraction on every single one. And remember, not just dual extraction, but the length and how long you do each one. Like, these are things that someone has to be a professional in practice.
Yeah, well, and that's a huge other thing that as people are becoming more fluent in how they ask questions, it almost creates more problems in certain ways, because then it's like people think that they know more than they actually do. And the dosing has been another huge thing, because it's like, we've made it common practice to put our sort of standard milligrams per milliliters on our bottle. But it's like, that's somewhat irrelevant to the actual quality of the final tincture, because you could do a process like ours where we're putting it through specific equipment under a gentle heat, getting a really full extraction and getting a really concentrated and quality extraction that you can see and taste and feel the difference of. And then you can take that same material and you could throw it in alcohol for 30 minutes and it's the same ratio of extract, but it's like, how do you say that one is more potent than the other without looking at it, seeing it, tasting it, smelling it? And to me, it's like the best test that we have right now is organoleptic. It's the quality, it's like what it looks like, it's what it smells like, it's what it tastes like, and it's the anecdotal evidence that we can get. Even if, like, I don't think anecdotal is the perfect basis, but whether or not something works for somebody is a huge indicator of whether or not it's an effective product.
Yep, that's why
So
our
would you-
CBD flies off the shelf, is because we educate people why we're different, then they try it and go, oh,
Yeah.
okay, I feel this.
So would you, just for my mind to understand, would you say that, like, technologically we just don't have the ability to test for all of the native bioactive molecules that are present in each different species? Because each species is going to have a whole host of different molecules, and you would need to test for each one, right?
Yeah.
In order to get an accurate picture.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, so I think, one, we have a very limited scope of what we actually know is in the mushrooms. We oftentimes know that they have beta glucans, but even different mushrooms have different types of beta glucans. And that was another thing I was talking to this other lab person about, was like, what if we got to a point where we could, like, identify the specific types of beta glucans? And he was even validating, like, oh yeah, well, it'd be really cool if you could identify the specific types, but also that the beta glucan stays in its native, like, helix form, because that megazyme test tells us that there was once beta glucans in their native form in there potentially, but it doesn't tell you whether or not they're still in that form, and they act way differently if they're in that form or if they're not in that form. And then from every mushroom, we have maybe like a handful of compounds, a little bit more if we've studied that mushroom a little bit more, but we don't know everything that's going on in there. And oftentimes there's hundreds, if not thousands, of compounds. And that's one of the things that I would really like to sort of see as a baseline, is like somewhere where we can kind of start getting like a fingerprint. I don't know how else to put it than that, but like a fingerprint of the mushroom or the mushroom extract, where we can, or both, right? Where we can like take a liquid chromatography or gas chromatography and then get a chart of peaks and valleys and be able to say, like, here's in a graph what the mushroom looks like. Because the biggest issue is, like, what happens is people, like, take that graph, they identify the main compounds, and then they investigate those compounds, and then they pull them out and identify them. But if you don't have a library of standards that includes those compounds, it's really hard to indicate or identify what those different compounds are. So it really takes inquisitive mind and also very developed lab standards to even be able to kind of like start to get to a point where we can get some of those lab standards. And that's just why some of them are so expensive as well. Like that's why you can't really effectively test for hericenones or erinacines, is just because like the process to get that standard material is so expensive that it makes it prohibitive to consistently test for.
Hmm. Do you think it's possible to over extract mushrooms? Can you, because I'm thinking like in the cannabis world, like certain terpenes will burn off at a certain temperature. So if
Yeah.
you expose them to too much heat, then you'll lose your terpenes. Is it possible to damage certain components by over extraction with mushrooms?
I would say for sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing you're at risk for is going to be burning the extraction with mushrooms. But that's one of the reasons, again, we kind of like every part of our process is like a little bit more difficult than it could be. But that's because we yield a better product out of it. So, again, early on in doing sort of experiments, and like you're talking about with the volatiles, so all of our extractions happen in a closed loop system. And we do the alcohol under a slightly gentle heat, and then we also do the water under a heat as well, but it's also in a closed system because early on I did some distillations of mushrooms just trying to see if I could get some essential oils or volatiles from the mushrooms. Not a lot of them would like really yield anything meaningful, but we would get what was referred to as like the hydrosol, right? Kind of like, hydrosol sprays and things like that have oils and things in it, and you could smell it and it was like, oh well, we didn't get an oil, but this has something going on in it. And I think about that as like, because that process is like a steam distillation. And you think about when you like boil a big pot of tea and then it's like steaming and it smells really nice, and you smell that with the mushrooms or the herbs or whatever you're working with. But that's like volatiles, that's goodies being driven off of the mushrooms or the herbs that you're working with. I don't think it's always necessarily destroying or like diminishing the medicinal benefit, but it's like, again, if we could start from the bottom and get as holistic as possible with the extraction in a closed loop system and capture all of those even like subtle volatiles. And that's even like, we haven't even touched on the spagyric aspect yet, but that's why we also pull the minerals from the mushrooms and put them in there, is like we're getting the whole picture of the mushroom as much as possible, and not really leaving anything out of that.
A full
So
spectrum fungi extract, just like we have full spectrum hemp extracts. We get all
yeah,
that
but to my mind,
goodness without damaging them
like a
out.
true full spectrum, not like the full
Right.
spectrum that has been kind of like co-opted by the mushroom industry.
Right, exactly. We use full spectrum from cannabis and apply it to this because it makes sense. Yeah, I don't know what the hell they're saying. Getting like what you said before with it includes the mycelated grain with it, and that's full spectrum. No, full spectrum means you're getting all of those medicinal properties out of the fruiting body or out of that hemp flower, and you're not damaging them, and you're preserving them the way they should be.
Yeah. Well, and I think parallels can be really helpful because it's like if you used full spectrum in cannabis the same way that they're talking about it in mushrooms, it's like maybe you have like a 2 to 3 inch plant that's like just started flowering, and you take that plant, that tiny little baby plant, and then you take the roots, and then you take all the dirt around the roots, and then you tincture all that, and then you say, oh well, that's a full spectrum hemp extract. It's like,
Exactly.
well,
Great
yeah,
analogy.
that's different. Yeah.
Yeah, I think people think it's like microgreens, or something
Mhm.
like that, where they are so packed with all of this stuff. Yeah, but same thing. Microgreens, we're not taking the dirt and everything that it's growing
Yeah.
on also and grinding that up.
Right.
Well,
Mhm.
I thought that was a freaking really good talk. I don't know about you, Carter, but I always enjoy listening, and I hope that it made a little bit more sense to people who are still trying to figure out the difference between, beta glucans, whether that's the only, factor that we're looking for, powders versus liquids, all of those things. And I just hope people understand why I, chose Jason, because this has all made sense to me because of my education and experience with how to make cannabis medicine. I knew that I could take that same knowledge that I learned about biology and plants and apply that to mushrooms, and you were doing it. So thank you again for being who you are in making sure that we have the best products out on the market.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, I think just to kind of sum everything up into like a tight little package, it's like I feel like we're, even 10, 12 years into this thing, and even more when you're considering kind of the people that came before me, is like we're still so early in this industry and just like trying to figure out the efficacy of medicinal mushrooms and how they are and how they work. And we're really just trying to understand them holistically and start from that as a baseline, and do it with the best starting material. It's like why do it if we're not doing it with that starting material? So I just want to thank you as well, for trusting me and believing in what we're doing, because I think that is another huge piece. I mean, we've had so many people over the years that are like, I want the best, I want the US grown, I want it extracted the proper way. And then it's like, you look at the US price tag and then you're like, oh, okay, well, I actually like don't want it that bad. And it's like, I feel like that says a lot about like what people's true intentions are and what people's true character are, because it's like, at that point it does become about the bottom dollar. And I think that there's a way that we move forward together sustainably and in vertically integrating some of the supply chain issues that we've experienced along the way. And I think that we'll get competitive with, I don't think it will ever be the same as the Chinese market, because I think, we'll never have the lax.
They got 40 years on us.
They've got 40 years on us. They have different environmental standards. They have different social standards for paying people. So it's just a different system that we work and live within. And I think there's so many reasons to support a local ecology and economy around this burgeoning industry.
Couldn't agree more.
Very cool. Very cool. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me on again. Look forward to the next one.
Awesome. Thank you, and see you soon.